Tēnā tātou katoa, hui hui nei tēnei wā. Welcome to our first set of webinars for this year and our very first webinar of this series on teaching high quality physical education. My name is Alan Ovens and I'm the leader of the Sport, Health and Physical Education discipline group at the University of Auckland. This is the first of a series of 4 seminars that we're hosting each Thursday through August. No doubt you would have seen the others because you've registered for today's one. But I just want to remind everyone that next week we have Dr. Hayley McGlashan talking about how can we make schools more inclusive for gender and sexually diverse youth. The following week on the 18th, we have Dr. Rod Philpott exploring how your teaching of health and PE can address issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this is content that's coming out of a multi-year and a multi-country project that he's been leading. Finally, on the 25th of August, I'm presenting alongside Marissa Mackay from PENS, Physical Education New Zealand, on making games more educational, which is an exploration of the MoveWell resource that was circulated by the Ministry of Education to all schools last year. I'm sure that there is much there that will stimulate and support teachers and you as you think about your health and physical education programs over the next few months. Just before I introduce Katie, I need to outline a few guidelines for our webinar. Feel free to put comments into the question and answer box down there. We'll save those questions till the very end. And if we've got time, then I'll be able to pose them to Katie and we can have a bit of a discussion. If you want to follow up anything from today, we're recording the presentation and we'll make it available and let you have the link by sending out just a reminder from our comms group. So let me introduce Dr. or Associate Professor Katie Fitzpatrick. Katie is currently the head of the School of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the University of Auckland. She's an outstanding scholar. And as you'll learn today, someone who can take really complex concepts and make them relevant to practice. Katie has a background in teaching health and physical education in high schools and universities and has led the writing of key national policy documents for the Ministry of Education. She was the lead writer of the Relationships and Sexuality Education Guide for Teachers, Leaders and Boards of Trustees that was released recently released over the last couple of years. And she's also co-led with Professor Melinda Weber, the Ministry of Education Policy on Mental Health Education, a guide for teachers, leaders and school boards. And the resource Mental Health Education and Hawara, Teaching Interpersonal Skills, Resilience and Wellbeing. So she's ideally placed today to talk about those issues and I'm sure you'll find it an exhilarating and a really informative presentation. So welcome, Katie, and I'll pass over to you.
Kia ora, Alan. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, ngau mai haere mai ki tēnei kōrero. I ngā mana whenua, tēnā koutou, kai ako, kai rangahau, e hoa mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nō rangi ora ahau, kei waipapa taumatarau I mahi ana, tēnā koutou. Kia orana, malueli lei, whakalofalahi atu, talofa lava, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Alan, and it's great to be a part of such a vibrant group of researchers in sport, health and physical education at the University of Auckland. Today I'm going to talk about some of my work in mental health education and some of the thinking that I've been doing about the relationship between this work and the rise of positive psychology and mindfulness, especially in school contexts. As Alan said, I have a background teaching in schools. I grew up in North Canterbury. This is the farm where my parents still live, just near the town of Rangiora. I taught in high schools in South Auckland, and I've done some work in curriculum policy, which is in part what's influencing this work and also making me think think differently about it. So I did work with a whole team of people on the health and physical education pages of the current New Zealand curriculum. And as Alan said, on the policy documents for relationships and sexuality education, that the first one was released in 2015, and then we updated it in 2020. And recently also on work in mental health education with Professor Melinda Webber. The first of these documents there on the right in mental health education isn't out yet. It's still with the Ministry of Ed, but it should be out sometime in schools this year. And with Melinda and Kat Wells from Linfield College and other people, we've also been working on some resources in mental health education in schools. I want to acknowledge the team that are part of the thinking that underpins my own scholarship, but also these documents. So this was the writing team of the mental health education guidelines: Te Kauaho Hoskins, John Finati, Darren Powell, Melinda Webber, Analosa Vikusu-Lungia, and Nick Mason. So some of this thinking has also been influenced by their work. And I want to acknowledge my debt also to scholars in the wider field of critical studies in health education, people like Dina Lay, Lizette Burrows, Louise McQuaig, Deborah Lupton, and Darren Powell, who also works with us at the University of Auckland. So these people and others, Michael Garden, Carolyn Plume as well, I'm very much affected by the critical scholarship in the broader field. So I just want to acknowledge that. What I want to do in this talk is ask some questions and do a little bit of disruption about this relationship that I see as occurring in relation to mental health and wellbeing in schools. So I'm following the diagram there on the left. There's an increasing concern in society, in the health sector, and in schools for mental health and wellbeing, especially of young people. So there's an assumption that mental health and wellbeing is a concern, and it's increasing. There's a commensurate pressure on schools for response, and this pressure is both external. It's coming from community and researchers in the health sector, but it's also internal. It's coming from young people themselves and from teachers in schools. And positive psychology and mindfulness are presented as one answer to this problem, and they seem to be gaining a lot of traction in schools and have quite a strong place. So as part of this talk, I want to ask some questions about this, and I want to trouble this relationship. I first want to ask, what is the basis of the research that says that mental health and wellbeing is a concern? How is this represented, and what do we know about it? And then I want to try and understand what the role of schools is in this. And also for us to kind of reflect on what is positive psychology, what is mindfulness, and what sort of assumptions is this work based on. I want to say from the start that I'm not against positive psychology or mindfulness. I've been influenced by the work in these fields myself, and I practice elements of it. So this isn't an argument to reject these, but to trouble this relationship and some of the assumptions underpinning it. In addressing these questions, I'm going to start at the end by reflecting first on what positive psychology and mindfulness are and some of the debates about them. And then I'm going to go to the top and look at what the basis of the research in mental health and wellbeing are, and then end with some reflections about how schools might respond and what a different kind of response might be. So positive psychology has interested me in the sense that it seems to have been rising exponentially, really, in terms of its attention in education and in schools. And it's important for us to reflect, I guess, on what it is. Although it seems like it's something new, it's actually also quite old, as Dina argues. In one sense, positive psychology is thousands of years old, dating back to the thoughts of ancient philosophers and religious leaders who discussed character values, happiness, and the good society. More recently, in the last 100 years, there have been behavioural scientists who've conducted research and scholarship on positive topics, such as, for example, altruism, personality strengths, and the study of happiness. Scholarship on positive psychology includes many different topics, including interest and flow, coping and resilience, virtues and character, intelligence and skills, creativity, and subjective well-being. The term itself was actually coined by Maslow, and it's related to the top part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which speak specifically to self-actualization skills. There's connections with the work of Mulhaley, Success Mulhaley, as well as particularly his notion of flow. But it was really Martin Seligman in the US who has taken it forward since the 1990s. He formed a positive psychology network in the USA of scholars working on human strengths and positive attributes rather than focusing exclusively on problems. So some of his work relates to work on the role of positive emotion in our lives, of the importance of meaning making, of engagement, of focusing on accomplishment, on decatastrophizing, which is an important skill for people who are experiencing anxiety, for example. And he focuses on human flourishing. And I think what's important about this work is that instead of focusing on the pathology, Seligman asks what makes happy people happy. So in some sense, positive psychology has created a counter to the pathological focus of clinical psychology, and it's made quite a big difference in that sense. There are a plethora of programs, online courses, degree programs, instructional guides for teachers, lesson plans, and websites that have sprung up around positive psychology. And if you're a teacher in a school or a school leader, you probably regularly get marketing materials offering these programs to you, or offering for sale programs for your students and school that you can undertake. So positive psychology has sort of got a lot of traction, and it's become quite a commercialized program and approach. It's built on particular assumptions, which I think are important for us to think about and understand. So it comes very much from a Western psychological framework. It focuses on the individual and on the cognitive. It explores how the cognitive is linked to the emotional, but mainly at the individual level. And it responsibilizes the individual and suggests that individuals can take some control over their own thinking, over their own emotions, and build skills, I guess, for resilience. There's some things that positive psychology is not, and I think this juxtaposition is also interesting. So it doesn't connect with non-Western or Indigenous epistemologies. It doesn't really align to collective or the social, political bases of health, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. It's not embodied or holistic, and it does not locate responsibility with society. So it does come from psychology and focuses on the individual. There's strengths and weaknesses to that. So if we focus a little bit on what mindfulness is, mindfulness is a form, I quite like this definition from Bayer and colleagues, that it's a form of present focused attention and awareness, first described in ancient Eastern meditation traditions, but widely discussed and practiced in contemporary Western culture. So it's sort of been adopted really into Western frameworks. From a Western psychological perspective, mindfulness is usually defined as intentionally focusing one's attention on experiences occurring in the present moment in a non-judgmental or accepting way. Stanley notes that mindfulness-based interventions have been found to be moderately effective for the treatment of stress, anxiety, and depression, and a variety of other disorders. It's also become a popular global phenomenon, and for some, even a movement or a revolution. This Anglo-American invention with Asian roots and transnational reach has moved rapidly from the monasteries of Southeast Asia to retreat centres, clinics, and classrooms of the Western world. And I'm sure many of you will be using mindfulness in classes and schools. It has got quite a lot of traction as well. So it's sort of got Buddhist roots, but it's been taken forward, especially in the US, by a medical scientist called John Kabat-Zinn. So it focuses on meditation, on body awareness, being in the moment, things like practicing gratitude, and it does highlight the individual, but in connection and awareness of relationalities between people, environment, etc. Stanley argues that the rise of mindfulness illustrates the parallel rise of psi and neuro expertise, and these forms of knowledge and authority are interpreted as replacements for declining religious traditions. Mindfulness illustrates trends in modernization, medicalization, and psychologization, which all suggest a gradual movement towards a secular age. So he's linking it quite strongly with secularism, although there are obviously debates about that as well. So some of the assumptions that are underlying mindfulness, it sort of has these Eastern philosophical roots, but it's adopted and adapted by Western psychology. It is quite individual as well, but it is a little bit more about connection and emplacement. It is embodied. It's also cognitive, but linked with the emotional and with cognitive behavior therapy and other skills. It also responsibilizes the individual, and it highlights detachment. Mindfulness is not, and the things that it's not as well are important to look at, I think. Like positive psychology, it doesn't focus on the collective or the social or political. It's debatably non-Western, so I think it does have Eastern roots, but it certainly doesn't specifically speak to Indigenous or other non-Western frameworks. It does not locate responsibility with society, and it's not really about activism in terms of the assumptions that it's operating on. There has been quite a lot of critique in the academic literature of positive psychology and mindfulness, and I'm just going to touch on a few points here. There is some concern that it has an overemphasis on the power of positivity, so that negative experiences and emotions might be underplayed, or as Held and King and Wong all argue, that negative conditions don't really dissipate through focusing on the positive. It also can risk presenting a dichotomous view of human experience as either positive or negative, and some work does this and others not so much. But Wong and Ruff and Singer all argue that human experience is a bit more messy than being able to separate emotions into either positive or negative. One critique as well is that it focuses on the individual and ignores the social determinants of mental health, which I'm going to speak to more shortly, including issues such as discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and other forms of exclusion. In terms of mindfulness, there's also some critique about the limitations of mindfulness, that it's connected very strongly to the kind of happiness agenda. It can separate people from the social and material world and perhaps brush over adverse experiences. Other scholars actually highlight that focusing too much in on those experiences can be counterproductive as well. So there's sort of some debate there. It can focus an inward focus. Some people argue it can lead to narcissism, or at least a pull away from activism and a focus more on the self and the individual. So a focus or a looking away from the political. I have some concerns that it's used as a behaviour tool in schools rather than a learning focus. Okay, so thinking about positive psychology and mindfulness, that was a sort of a quick intro really to what they are. So I want to go up to the top of this diagram now to think about mental health and well-being being a concern in schools, and what the basis of this work is, how we know that this is actually a problem. So there's a bunch of mental health research. I'm only going to focus on a couple of studies and a couple of pieces from New Zealand, but this is quite indicative of quite a lot of different work focusing here in Aotearoa, but also around the world. So there's sort of an acceptance in the research that there's an upward trend of mental health issues, emotional distress, behaviour problems, depression and anxiety among young people and among adults. So this is the New Zealand Health Survey data that shows the trend from 2011 right through to 2021, which is the most recent data. And you can see on the top line, emotional or behavioural problems have trended up for children 0 to 14 from 3.3% up to 5.7%. So roughly getting close to a doubling. The depression, you can see an upward trend, and anxiety as well. So the New Zealand Health Survey data is a survey-based in-home survey that is completed by parents asked a range of questions about the health and well-being of themselves and their children. And it's accepted as representative. Here's the adult data, so 15 plus, and you can see there are more indicators here, including psychological distress, which is seen as low or moderate, mood or anxiety disorder, depression, anxiety disorder, and so forth. If you look at the depression rate there from 14.2% in 2011, trending up to 17% in 2021. So this data shows that according to this survey, the reporting would suggest an upward trend in New Zealand of psychological distress, mood, depression disorders. This is backed up by the Youth 19 survey of teenagers in high schools in New Zealand. So you'll be aware of the Youth 2000 survey data that has been consistently researched in schools since the year 2000. There's a range of different years that's happened. The most recent one is 2019, so prior to the pandemic. From a really large survey instrument with around 7,000 young people, Youth 19, in high schools, so 13 to 18-year-old young people. And from this survey data, the team saw 23% of students showing significant symptoms of depression. They note that this was particularly high for students in low decile schools and in high deprivation neighbourhoods, and for students who identified on the survey as female. They also noted that stress, distress and suicide risk, according to this survey, is generally elevated among sexual and gender minority youth, and that these risks are much lower in schools and communities that are rainbow friendly. And they note an upward trend in terms of depression symptoms in Māori and Pacific youth as well. The third study I just want to mention really briefly is Kerry Gibson's work. She's in psychology at the University of Auckland, and she did a big interview study with hundreds of young people looking at what they want from mental health services. And though it wasn't focused on schools specifically, she noted that there's a lot of difficulty with access to mental health care from young people, and that the lack of access to mental health care for young people involves practical considerations, but also whether young people feel that the professional help is easily available to them. So she notes that from this interview data that young people really do want more provision of mental health services. So if we look at these three studies and some of the other research, they're based on particular assumptions and particular measures that create a kind of truth regime about mental health and well-being. I think it's important to note that they are based mainly on psychological measures such as the WHO 5, which I've put down there, which is the World Health Organization 5 Wellbeing Index, which is a internationally used wellbeing measure. They're also based on depression scales, and in the case of Kerry Gibson's work with interviews. The New Zealand Health Survey asks people for self-reporting, and these, I guess, all of these studies create a kind of pressure on the health system, and also reflect the pressure, so that there's these studies in relation to other kinds of pressures, such as the mental health inquiry, for example, create a kind of a picture where we see that there is pressure on the health system, there's pressure on schools. This is combined with anecdotal reports and experiences, and every teacher and every school leader that I talk to tells me that they are seeing it in schools in terms of a rise in young people experiencing and expressing distress. We also hear this in the media, at conferences, from people in the health sector, and expert commentary. So all of this sort of combines to create this picture of mental health and wellbeing for young people, and it's also based on a range of assumptions. So these studies and the bigger discourse of media and the health sector and expert commentary, I think this all combines to position schools in particular kinds of ways, and teachers and students in particular kind of ways. So schools are seen in this as a site of health intervention, and this is accepted as a reasonable conclusion, and teachers are put under pressure. Young people, I think, are positioned in this in interesting ways. They're positioned as quite vulnerable, as deserving of help, as needing of help, and needing perhaps rescue, and an idea that young people are constantly vulnerable and at risk. And I think this can be questioned. It definitely individualizes health. So in some ways, this data is because it also comes from psychological frameworks. It focuses on the individual and suggests an individualized approach. So it's no surprise then that psychology becomes seen as a little bit of a savior or an intervention. It also creates a discourse of responsibilizing. So it suggests that in order to fix these issues, then we need individuals to become responsible, ethical subjects who are engaged in self-improvement. Related to this, there's sort of this call and increase for public-private partnerships to solve the problems that perhaps the state has failed to address. And I'm not going to really talk about that in this presentation, but my colleague Darren Powell does specific work on this. I think it creates ongoing confusion about the place of curriculum, and specifically health education curriculum that I'm interested in. That curriculum gets overlapped and confused with health policy and health interventions. And in my own work, I try to make a distinction between education for health, so that's education that aims for health or wellbeing outcomes, and education about health, which is education that studies health as a discipline. I think, curiously, mental health has become the new vector for schools as intervention sites. And Michael Gard and Carolyn Plume have sort of traced the history, especially in the US, of the relationship between health programs, health outcomes, health promotion, and schools. And it's no surprise that schools have always actually been a site for health interventions, and we've seen various ones over time. But mental health seems to be one of the new foci for that. I think the other thing that this research does, which I think we can trouble, is that Māori and Pacific youth are presented here as a bit of a problem, as more vulnerable, as are queer youth or LGBTQI plus youth. And I think that's also important to think about in relation to this, especially if an individualised approach is being advocated, that can be problematic. I'm influenced by the work of Brendan Hokowhitu, who argues with post-colonial theory that this kind of desire to categorise, and I think we see this in some of the big health survey survey approaches, that there's a categorizing and a pathologizing of mental health that definitely imposes a Western framework. So he argues that in ontological terms, pathologizing in his example, Māori, serves the allegorical function of describing the desired healthy body. For a society ensconced and founded upon the desire to universalize knowledge, there's a fundamental investment in coding alterity within the realms of rationality. So I think the notion that one of the impacts, one of the things that this data does, and the reproduction of this data, is that it codes alterity. And I think we can ask some questions about the impact of that. Whenever health survey data is presented and there's a related approach, concern about something, a health issue like mental health in this case, then it creates all kinds of causal stories, which is a term that Journeyman, Ball and Santori apply. They're education policy scholars, and they sort of suggest that when a problem is presented like this, then there's a requisite moralizing, I guess, and a need for us to know why. If youth health issues are increasing and distress of young people is increasing, then why? Why is this happening? And we see this engaging in the media a lot, but there's lots of research that wants to understand this reality as well. So some of the causal stories that are circulating, and when I use the word stories, that's not to suggest that there's not evidence for them, because there is evidence for all of these. So some of the causal stories are related to social media, to screen time, of course, COVID-19, climate change, the constant news feed, dating apps, sexual violence, early experiences. Some people say it's about more reporting. Others want to talk about parenting and family relationships. So there's research and popular discourse that circulates around all of these things to try to get to the bottom of what causes the increase in mental health and distress. This also creates or leads to another trajectory of thinking, in that if we have causal stories, then we can find the answer. And this relates to also what Journeyman and colleagues talk about, a moral economy of hope. So if we know the cause of mental health and distress issues, then we can have hope that something can be done about it. We can intervene, we can make a difference. And a good example of this is this work from the editors of a journal, New Directions for Youth Development, in 2014. And the editors of this journal argue that it's the worst time for adolescents because of the rise of mental and emotional and behavioural disorders. But they also state it may equally be the best of time for adolescents today because of the abundance of groundbreaking scientific discoveries that are emerging in areas such as neuroscience, positive youth development and resiliency that can inform the development and implementation of interventions aimed at deterring problems and promoting well-being in adolescents. So they're saying that, the terrible state of things isn't so bad because actually there's all the scientific and psychological development that's going to save young people and be an answer for this. And they absolutely single out mindfulness. So one such innovation that holds much promise for helping adolescents reach their potential, quite a big claim, is mindfulness. So this is an example of the creation of a moral economy of hope. So just to summarise where I've kind of got to so far in the argument, there's sort of these individualised measures based on survey data and Western psychological norms. They sort of create this pathology that codes alterity, including that of Māori, Pacific, LGBTQI plus communities. And there's sort of the circulating and research around causal stories. This in turn creates a moral economy of hope where it's natural that positive psychology and mindfulness come in to the narrative here. positive psychology and mindfulness are helpful in terms of thinking through this argument, I guess, and how we've got to here, because they do contend with the pathological framing. They are an individual intervention, they create self-responsibilization, and they focus on skills. So it's natural that schools then become the target as health intervention sites for the teaching of skills. There's obvious links with behaviorism, and schools already, operate under a ontology of Western individualism. So this all kind of makes sense in one sense, except all of this is based on the assumption that we know the cause of mental health issues and that we accept that schools can actually intervene. And this is where I think this whole circle and flow can be interrupted. So if I come to what is the role of schools, I think the first question we have to ask is still at the top, is around what is the basis of the conclusion that mental health and wellbeing are a concern, and what is the cause of mental health issues, which is a much more complex answer than some of the causal stories would lead us to believe. So for those of you who are familiar with the social determinants of health, the social determinants are very well evidenced theory about how public health concerns, epidemiological data, and what the basis of these are internationally. So the determinants of health suggest that all health issues are a really complex intersection of big picture environments in combination with individual behaviours and genetics. So the determinants of health include the social and economic environment, physical environment, a person's individual characteristics and behaviour, but massively powerful in this are income and social status, education, physical environment, social support networks, genetics, health services, and social positioning and identity, such as gender, ethnicity. So Compton and Shim note that the social determinants of health, such as discrimination and social exclusion, adverse early life experiences, poor education, unemployment, underemployment, job insecurity, income inequality, poverty, deprivation, poor access to sufficient healthy food, poor housing quality and housing instability, adverse features of the built environment, and poor access to healthcare predispose individuals and populations to poor health. Now, it's really important. The reason I listed all of those is because we can ask the question that if the complex intersection of all of these things, how many of these can schools actually impact? Probably very few. So given the intractable social and political bases of these issues and of mental health and the complexity of dealing with them, then it seems naive to suggest that positive psychology and mindfulness skills might intervene and be the answer to the problem of mental health. Compton and Shim note in this book, which is really worth looking at in terms of the social determinants of mental health, that mental health and risk for mental illness are substantially shaped by policy and politics. Taking action to promote mental health and reduce risk for mental illnesses is thus a political and policy-related process. For example, a youth's quality and extent of education certainly have long-term health implications, and improving educational quality, reducing high school dropout, enhancing access to higher ed are all objectives that clearly necessitate a policy and political approach. So I'm going to return briefly now to finish up and think about, so given all of this, what is the role of schools? And I think schools are well placed to actually return to a focus on curriculum. So schools, in some ways, and it's a relief for those of you who are teachers, is that we can't fix mental health in schools. Mental health is a social and political, historical issue. But we can educate and we can support young people and provide really positive environments for them. And this is where I think mental health education comes in. So if we see mental health education and health and education more generally as education about health, as in the study of health, not education for health, as in an intervention that tries to fix something or solve the problem of mental health, then we can focus on learning. That's what we try to do in this book, in the resource, and in the mental health education guidelines, but there's lots of other people doing work on this as well. And I suggest that positive psychology and mindfulness can be useful for us in health education, but not by themselves. That we also need to look at studying some of the determinants of health, at addressing issues like discrimination and bullying in our schools. We need to centralise Te Ao Māori and Mātauranga Māori and Pacific knowledge systems, help young people think about stress management, help seeking, collective action, and explore personal identity. So all of these things and others might become part of the study of mental health education in schools. Rachel Dixon's thesis on health education in schools is excellent and really worth reading. And I think she notes that health education curriculum time can be seen as a vehicle for a wide range of health interventions, and that this is a problem. She imagines a different kind of reality and suggests that health education has the very real potential to enable young people to be health educated, critically health literate, and globally competent citizens who are ready, willing, and able to thrive in an uncertain world. And the New Zealand Health Education Association, which Rachel's been really influential in combination with Jenny Robertson, they define mental health education and the many topics that derive from this key area of learning. And they suggest that it provides valuable, authentic, and engaging learning contexts for students to help them understand themselves, others, their community, the country, and the world that they live in. So you can see that positive psychology and mindfulness might play a small role in this, and we might study them and understand them alongside a range of other content. So that's the end of my talk. I just want to we're going to have questions in a second, but I just want to remind you that next week at the same time, my colleague Hayley McGlashan is going to be giving the next webinar on how can we make schools more inclusive for sex, gender, and sexually diverse youth. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I'll just once again remind everybody that if you want to ask Katie a question, if you just drop that into the Q&A at the bottom, you'll see a little button at the bottom of the webinar, and I'm very happy to pass that on to Katie. Katie, I wanted to start with where would a teacher start, do you think? And I'm presuming they already have started, so we're dropping in the middle, I suppose, of some really important work that teachers are doing. But where would somebody put some of their priorities, do you think, and especially in a primary school at the moment?
Well, I think there's a couple of different places to start. I think schools first need to connect with their communities and families and think about what's actually going to be a priority, because as we know, our schools are really diverse and they are different in different parts of the country, urban schools, rural schools, depending on the makeup of students. So I don't think there's one size fits all, and I think we're excellent in New Zealand at responding differently to different communities. So I think in the bigger picture, the conversation starts with the school and the school leadership and teachers and the community, including iwi and hapu and whānau, to look at defining what wellbeing is, what mental health is, what it looks like for young people, and what's already happening. I think the other thing that I encourage schools to do is to conduct a strengths-based analysis, and that can be simply a process of looking at all the things that are already happening in the school that are going really well, and then looking at what might be next. There's no school that I know of who would be starting from scratch in this. Schools have a lot of really amazing, impactful, and supportive things going on for kids and young people. And then I think individual teachers can start thinking about what the needs of their students are and engaging with some of the great resources that are there. So the Health Education Association has free resources on their website, the NZHEA. The book that we worked on, the ministry are also engaging in looking at presenting new resources. And then the John Kirwan Foundation, who we've been partnering with in a program called Mighty, they're also working directly with schools to partner and support mental health education for primary schools. So I think there's a range of places to start.
And I think what earlier in the talk, you really highlighted that it's a space which is really crowded with a lot of ideas and a lot of resources, a lot of books, and teachers have. I suppose it's a function of modernity, really, that the information is rich out there, but it's not necessarily quality information. And so it is worth just emphasizing that the Health Teachers Association and the ministry have some excellent resources that are available that can help guide you through this sort of what Katie's outlined as a potential I don't want to use the minefield, but it is easy to focus on the wrong thing. And in that sense, Darren has asked the question, what do you see as some of the key unintended, even unhealthy consequences that might occur when schools or teachers focus on mental health outcomes rather than mental health education?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've had discussions with several schools in the last couple of years who have felt under pressure to measure wellbeing using different measures that you can find online. There are various tools. And I think this can be really problematic because as educators, we're not qualified, we're not clinicians, we're not psychologists or psychiatrists or counsellors. So if we start measuring and trying to diagnose young people, I think that can lead us down a very slippery slope because we're not qualified to do it, and we're not qualified to put in place the support that might be needed. We can also misinterpret that data because a lot of those wellbeing measures are, like I've said, they're based on exclusively individualised Western frameworks. They've often been tested with adult populations. And so they may not be appropriate for kids, and they may not be appropriate for kids in New Zealand. So I think we just want to steer away from that. I think it's really important when we are doing work in mental health and wellbeing that we focus on learning, and there may be issues such as disclosures, and young people may express distress, and we want to ensure that our schools have policies and procedures to support us as teachers, because we should be able to get help and support with that and know what to do when that happens. I think most teachers are excellent at knowing their students and knowing how to respond and when something's not right with the student and passing that on. So I think we have to be careful to wade into territory that looks at diagnosing, at measuring mental health and wellbeing. I would say it's as bad as measuring BMI or using other kinds of measures that are not about learning. So yeah, I think we should focus on the learning and what that opens up.
Okay, there's another question here where somebody was really interested in the data that we're presenting, and especially that the numbers are trending upwards. And what are your thoughts on this?
It's interesting. I mean, there's certainly evidence that that using the same measures, and I'm not an expert in quantitative psychology, but those measures are certainly using the same measure over a period of time, such as the New Zealand Health Survey, does show that there is an increase in people expressing distress and increasing diagnoses. And there's lots of theories, some of those causal stories about why that is the case. There is some evidence to suggest that there's greater awareness and that people are more likely to answer in particular ways of those surveys, because we know a lot more about issues like anxiety and depression. So it may be also that people are talking about it more and more willing to get diagnosed, to identify with some of those issues. There's certainly evidence for that. But I don't think there's any doubt that issues like anxiety and depression are increasing among young people, and that we do want to look at how we can support and educate. I don't want to minimize that. I think it's really important for us to be aware, but I think we can also ask questions about those measures, and that they do definitely come from a Western psychological framework and might be viewed differently from other knowledge systems.
Okay, there's a quick question here. Could the increased knowledge about the awareness of mental health actually be somewhat responsible for the increased numbers that we're seeing?
Yeah, so some people do argue that, and I think others argue that that's actually a positive thing. So the more that we know about anxiety and depression, for example, although those are constructed within a Western psychological framework, it can be really useful for some people to have diagnoses, to understand those conditions, and then to have skills and knowledge to address them. Other people argue that the diagnosis itself can be a really negative and problematizing thing. And I think that's going to be different depending on individuals and values and cultures.
Okay. There's a question here from Aspasia Dania. Aspasia is at the University of Athens, so it's lovely to see you online, Aspasia. Her question is, how can we support teacher educators to see the moral economy of hope through the critical lens that you've presented?
Yeah, great question. So I guess I engage in my own moral economy of hope, but it's not, it doesn't suggest that there's a fix or an easy answer, I guess. And that's kind of why I want to trouble positive psychology and mindfulness, because they're seen as an easy answer. And I think mental health and well-being are really complex. I think the way that I would address it critically is for us to be realistic and to ask questions about what the role of schools is. I think the moral economy of hope work is quite similar to Lauren Ballant's work on cruel optimism, that we engage constantly in this belief that this thing, this time, this is going to be the answer to problems of oppression. And actually, there's a really complex political, historical, and social bases of these issues that are not easy to address. And the mental health work, for example, in the resources, we suggest that schools look at issues such as racism, for example, and in New Zealand, that means studying New Zealand history, the history of colonisation, and the basis of racial discrimination. Now, that's complex work and it takes time and it's not easy, but it's really important, I think, to undertake. So for me, that would be the critical response.
Okay, another question here from Mo Jafar from the University of East London. Lovely to see you, Mo, online. I know it must be very early there, so I'm really thankful. Thank you for getting up so early. Mo says, asking from the UK here, but we would see similar issues with access to mental health interventions. Students can be left waiting on public health lists for long periods. So would you say there is a place for school-based interventions to help plug the gap? Appreciate the point around the lack of expertise too.
Yeah, I don't want to see teachers being the interveners, I guess. I think there is really strong evidence about the important role of health services in schools, in mental health, but also in gender and sexuality, in terms of being safe, free, convenient, and hopefully, if schools have got it right, also private places for young people to access care. So I think there is a lot of evidence about the importance of health services in schools, and that creates, that requires us to do political advocacy to make sure that free health services are available to schools. And I think that frees teachers up in a way to then have the support that they need to get on with teaching the curriculum. The work that when we did consultation for the mental health education guidelines, we ran some focus groups of young people, and one of the strongest things they told us was that they want to know how to support each other. So when their friends are feeling distressed, they said, you know, they're not going to, their first port of call is not going to be the school counsellor or the school nurse or a teacher or a parent. They're going to go to their friends first. This is teenagers. And so they wanted to know what skills, how can we support our friend when they're feeling mental distress. So I think there's a beautiful role then for teachers to look at studying interpersonal skills, communication skills, support skills, help seeking skills, so that young people can be the first line of support for each other, while not taking on full responsibility for that, but also understanding how to access health services.
Okay, excellent. We're having a few questions start to come through, which is wonderful. Thank you. I want to be able to wind this up and keep it to 1 hour. There's a question here from Jill Noble. What are your thoughts on the wellbeing at school, which is the New Zealand Council for Educational Research project? Is it? I'm not a favour with that one.
Yeah, that's tools that NZCER have developed for schools to sort of undertake an analysis. I think it's really useful. They focus at quite a big picture whole school approach, so it doesn't tend to focus really on curriculum, but it does look at what's happening in the school, and it's a tool that schools can use to give them a read, I guess, and a bit of an evaluation tool. The John Kirwan Foundation Mighty project has a different one that we developed for them that's also really useful, and I think multiple tools can be useful for schools too as a starting place, and it might just highlight some areas that the school could strengthen in a whole school approach. We've drawn on quite a lot of work from NZCER in the mental health education guidelines. I think they're doing some great work.
All right then. So I'm going to pause there. I know there's a couple of extra questions there. Kylie's question, Kellyanne from Australia. Hi Kelly, nice to see you online, and Paula Burnett also. So, but I'd like to pause there and perhaps give Katie you the last word, just to wrap us up for this week, and we can finish off there.
Okay, great. Please do feel free to email me as in a follow up for this webinar. I really appreciate the range of people coming online, whether you're teachers or researchers or other interested parties, especially people internationally. Yeah, I think for me, that the critical approach, which is what all of our group really at the University of Auckland here are valuing in the Richard Tinning Research Unit, is to be engaging deeply in this kind of work and how important it is, but also as we go to trouble it, to be asking the kind of critical questions about what's the basis of knowledge that we're promoting, and what are the effects of the sorts of work that we're doing and that are going on. So thank you so much, Alan, for your great hosting and organising this series, and your leadership. Yeah, and we can finish up there. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Wonderful. Thank you everybody, and a special thank you to Katie. Thank you very much. It's been a fantastic and very informative presentation. Thank you.